Hi everyone, let's talk about the best historical evidence that we have for Jesus.
Please, let's do.
I'm Candida Moss, I'm the Edward Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham, and I'm a Bible scholar.
And I am Jeff for Truth, and I will be telling you what Professor Moss says that is true, that is false, and that is misleading.
A friend of mine asked me if I would make a video explaining the historical evidence for Jesus, and it's not great.
That is true. The evidence for Jesus is not great, but it's not even good. In fact, it's embarrassingly bad. The evidence that Jesus was a God is so unreliable, it is not even worthy of an intellectual conversation. What Professor Moss and I are talking about is simply the evidence to support a real Jewish rabbi who was crucified by Pontius Pilate in the 30s.
So if you think about the pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land that you might visit if you went to Israel today to see, you would go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you would go to Bethlehem, you would go to all of these sites that tradition says are places that Jesus lived or was born or died or did something important in. The problem is that in the best case scenario, those traditions go back to the 4th century CE when the Emperor Constantine and his mother Helena were looking for these sites. But we're still talking about a period some 300 or so years after Jesus lived and died.
So what she means there is the church traditions were developed over 300 years later, and that totally discredits their claims to authenticity. Every holy site is just a tourist attraction and a deception, and every Christian relic is a fake or a forgery. Christianity was created by the Roman Empire not because they believed in the resurrected Jewish Messiah, but because the religion was specifically built by the Roman Empire to control the minds of the populace.
If you were looking for something like an inscription from the 1st century, we just don't have it, nor would we expect to have it, because Jesus was a Mediterranean peasant. He wasn't an emperor who was having coins struck with his image on them, or was setting up inscriptions throughout the empire. So we wouldn't expect to find anything tangible like that.
So Jesus didn't write anything himself, nor did anyone who lived at the time of Jesus write anything about him. And Professor Moss is saying that Jesus was such an insignificant figure that we shouldn't even expect anyone to have written about him during his lifetime. You see, she is not giving any credibility whatsoever to the Bible claims that Jesus was a divine supernatural being. That is not even a remote possibility to an intelligent person who has studied the evidence.
Instead, our best evidence are actually the text of the New Testament.
So she openly admits that our best evidence for Jesus is the Christian New Testament. But she's already revealed that she discredits church tradition and biblical claims of Jesus' divinity.
The writings of the Apostle Paul, or the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark. And we certainly have a lot of people writing within a few decades referring to a man named Jesus who existed.
I completely disagree with her on several things here. The writings of Paul, all the writings of Paul, are highly suspect. The existence of the Paul character is highly suspect at best. Josephus would have been a contemporary with Paul at the same time, in the same place, and in the same religion, but he never mentions Paul at all. The only person who writes about the life of Paul is the anonymous author of Acts, who is supposedly the same guy who said he was writing the gospel attributed to Luke based on a careful consideration of the things that were written by many people before him. And the reasons that scholars say the earliest gospel of Mark must have been written after the destruction of the temple are the exact same reasons why Paul's letters to the Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians must have been written after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Those main two reasons are because there is no evidence that these books were written prior to 70, and they make references to the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. Then she says we have a lot of people who wrote within a few decades who testified that Jesus existed. This is false. She is simply stating a consensus position that is nothing more than an assumption with no validity and an attempt to appease Christian sensitivities. There is no reliable evidence that any Christian existed prior to 70 CE, just as there is no evidence that any Christian writing existed within a few decades of the supposed death of Jesus.
Now, it's a little bit of a problem that most of those people don't seem to have met Jesus himself, but
Here she is downplaying the fact that there are no eyewitness accounts of Jesus. This is another attempt to appease Christian sensitivities. We just need to speak the truth and show the evidence, and if people find out that what they believe in is based on lies, then we need to provide the assistance needed to help them accept reality instead of encouraging them to waste their lives believing things that we know are false.
They do offer evidence that Jesus was a real person who lived and did stuff and died and made enough of an impact that people decided to write these stories about him.
So she already admitted that Jesus was so insignificant that we wouldn't expect to find any contemporaneous inscriptions or writings about Jesus. But now she changes her assessment and says Jesus was so significant that many people wrote about him even though they were not eyewitnesses to Jesus. This is not logical. Why would the people who never met Jesus think he was more significant than the people who saw him? When people write about the significance of a supernatural religious character that they never met, the most rational and likely conclusion is that the character is an ideology and not a real person.
So our earliest historical evidence is actually going to be manuscripts, little fragmentary copies of those texts. Those date back to, at the very earliest, the 2nd century.
This is correct. Our earliest physical evidence of any Christian writing is dated to the 2nd century, which is more than just a few decades after the events. It is more accurate to say our earliest manuscript evidence is over a century after the supposed death of Jesus.
But we're still just talking about fragments. Most of our manuscripts come from much, much later.
Right. So Jesus grew in popularity over the centuries, and this in no way testifies that Jesus was a real person. This only supports the ideology of Christianity growing out of the Roman influence.
I have made it easy for you to find out the truth about the origin of Christianity. Just read my book, Jesus Demigod, Putting the Lord on Trial, available on Amazon.